Jon, thank you so much for joining us again. It's your hat trick. No hat trick ball, but it's your hat trick. It's your third appearance on An Echo of Glory. I have to say, the last 2 times you've come on, we on the back of a defeat, so we are in a better mood today. Beating United, I think you came on, we lost to Newcastle this season, Fulham the season before, so delighted to have you on after a win. You in a glorious position, you told me earlier, of re-watching Tottenham Hotspur 1, Manchester United 0. Feel sorry for you there. Before we get into Ange overall, just your thoughts on yesterday's game.
Yeah, it was an interesting fixture between two teams who I think have got a lot to play for this season in terms of having to make a change at this sort of period of the season. So with that context in mind, the game was, I thought, quite sloppy for long periods.
Yeah.
And I think in the second half in particular, Spurs didn't want to cede too much space, and so allowed the game to become quite transitional in a bid to hold on to the 1-0 lead. And so, yeah, the second half in particular became quite open, I thought. But the first half, I think Spurs controlled it for on and off long periods, but then were open at times at the back and looked in danger of conceding as well. So a really tricky game to really get your teeth into in many respects.
Yeah, we've just been saying that very same stuff, really. Overall, then, the Ange project, you mentioned in your most recent analysis, which I think was just after Villa, injuries have certainly affected our press, which is such a key component of Angeball. But actually, teams are now playing through us easier than the start of the season. How much of an excuse do you think injuries are? And overall, where does that leave Ange? How sustainable at the moment is this?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, because I think that what has happened in the Spurs fan base is a sort of opening out of different positions. On the one side, people using the injuries as an excuse to blame the press for not working, and then on the other side, people arguing that, well, obviously the injuries are caused by the intensity of the press, and as a result, then I think that it's very hard to sort of get any kind of starting position in any debate about whether or not the press is good or bad. In part, that's because pressing is a tricky aspect of football to get your head around, because a lot of the time, every team out of possession has weaknesses, and the whole idea of a good press is a press which allows you to overcome the weaknesses in your system in the most functional way. So it's tricky talking about Spurs pressing, I think, because on the one hand, at the beginning of the season, the press largely worked, and it was, the intensity of the press actually papered over some of the cracks of the structure. But then the question is, well, does that make it a bad press which is being papered over, or is it a good press because it doesn't give up any kind of space or attacking advantages to the opposition? And it's a tricky one. So I think that's why the question of the injuries is so important, because if you can prove in some way that the press is unsustainable from the point of view of injuries, then you can make an argument that it's not good enough as a press, because your press has to be good enough for 50 games of a season,
Correct.
Not just the first 10, 15 games of a season. At the same time, there isn't really that evidence there, I don't think. Like, there's no drop-down, drag-out argument where you could be like, the press is causing these problems. And so there's going to be a lot of people who are not going to accept that the intensity of the press has led to the injury crisis. I guess it's getting to a point where it's hard to argue against that. And, if it happened again next season and there was the same drop-off midway through the season, I think it would be very hard to argue that there isn't some kind of correlation. But at the same time, I think my position on the pressing has always been that, it's structurally problematic. There's problems with the press, which I think are there, and you can only get away with that if your players are able to be fully intense and are able to solve problems as they go. And clearly that's not happening at the moment. It's not happening as much when your first team players aren't in there. And I think for me, that's a worrying sign, because it suggests that you have to have your players performing to the best of their ability all the time in order for the press to function. So, yeah, the question is whether or not you can fix those problems easily or not without the whole project collapsing. And my argument from the beginning has always been, actually, there's some simple fixes you could make here that would result in the press still being effective and still producing turnovers in high areas, which I think has been actually a fairly good way of you guys producing chances without actually having to be as intense as it is all the time.
Is it too easy? And please tell me if so, because I'm not, I'm a stats guy, I'm not a tactics guy. I think there's a difference. Just to say, for me to sit here and say, it's not Wraith Rovers, it's not St Johnstone. Is it too simple to say that?
I mean, it's an easy argument to make, but at the same time, I think that there is value to that kind of argument for a number of reasons. That, on the one hand, when Postecoglou was in Scotland, his teams dominated possession, so they were having to possess the ball for much longer periods of time. So you can get away with, I would say, having an intense form of press when you're, largely going to be holding onto the ball with possession. And then on top of that, you're playing against players who aren't going to be able to, find the weaknesses in your pressing system at the same time. So it's absolutely a fair criticism to say this press maybe worked elsewhere. Is it fit for purpose in the Premier League? And I did a long thread. This was even before Postecoglou was linked to Spurs. This was when he was being linked to other Premier League sides, saying that I had worries about how the press would scale up to the elite level. We obviously had the evidence of Celtic playing against European sides where I think the press was often found out. Add on top of that the fact that then there is the intensity needed to actually paper over some of those cracks, and then the question is whether or not you can play that amount of time out of possession with that level of intensity in order to fix the problems in your press. So I don't want to just sit here and say the press is not fit for purpose, but I think the press is fit for purpose. I think that all presses that you can actually get to work, in some sense, are fit for purpose. But the question isn't, can this work for 90 minutes? It's, as we said before, can this work for a 50-game season? And that's what I'm interested in as a tactical analyst. How do you maybe moderate this press a little bit so that it's not just either on or off, right? Which is how it feels at the moment. You either go and everyone goes and you go all the time, or you sit deep and you don't put pressure on at all.
I think you're 100% right. And a lot of the concerns that I have is this sustainable for a 50, 60-game season, particularly when you start looking at the overall running stats, which we are, as we've discussed with the press, the most intense team off the ball. We're also the most intense team on the ball. And there's been some great stats and graphs around that. But what concerns me is the stat that when we run more than the opposition, we win 53% of our games. When the opposition runs more than us, we lose 91% of games. There's a very big disparity there. And that's got to be a huge concern tactically and in terms of sustainability, no?
I think so, yeah. I think, and again, this comes back to what I was saying before, that you have to distinguish between the amount of intensity you need for a press to work and the structure of that press. And I think there does come a point where if you are relying on intensity for your press to work, then it becomes an issue, not only because it will cause, I think, an undue amount of intensity to make that press work over a long period of time, but also, as we've said, once that intensity drops off, suddenly the press doesn't look as functional as it was anymore. I think it is worth saying that the data that's been put out regarding the intensity of sprints and pressing for Spurs this season, that the argument is made that, well, it's not like a massive magnitude bigger than what the rest of the teams are doing, but my argument has always been Spurs are an outlier. They are running more with and without the ball. And I think as soon as you're in that sort of scenario where you're doing something out with what everyone else in the league is doing, I already have alarm bells going, being like, why is everyone else not running with this kind of intensity? If you could get away with playing at that intensity with a bigger depth of squad, why are the teams that have, that depth of squad that could allow them to run that much doing it as well. So I often flip the argument back on its head, because there's a lot of people out there who will say, well, if we had a depth of squad and we had all of our players from injury, then this would be a functional way of playing football out of possession, and in possession, of course, as you mentioned. But for me, that's always the way that I will initially think, is that, well, if it was functional and you could get away with being this intense, surely every team would be doing it, because it gives you a massive advantage.
Let me ask you very quickly, when teams are running more than us and we are then losing 90% of the games that teams are losing more than that teams are running more than us, what's the tactical reason for that? What are we not doing when teams are running more than us that says we're getting beat?
You put me on the spot.
Oh, sorry, I put you on the spot. Yeah, I have put you on the spot. But I'm interested in just generally, I have put you on the spot, but from your observations, a team runs more than us, works harder than us. It's not always the way that a team should lose 90% of games in which that happens. So putting you on the spot, what is going on with us in that scenario?
I think a lot of it just comes down to the fact that if your press requires you to cover a lot of distance, which is why I think there's a lot of intensity in your pressing, and you aren't able to make those distances, then your press is going to be open.
Gaps,
and the opposition are just going to be able to play through you. Right?
We're 2 passes away. We're 2 passes away from being cut open. Sometimes even 1 pass.
But then, is there not? Do you think? And again, putting you on the spot, a bit of a naivety in the way that we're being coached, in the sense that we need to learn to sit in sometimes. We need to learn to sit in, defend, grind it out, and hit a team on the break.
Like a Brentford away?
Sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, the Brentford away game is interesting, because I think that's not a particularly sustainable way of playing either, even though you got the win in that game.
Yeah.
For me, it's about moderation. It's you don't need to go in utter intensity the whole time. So one of the things that I've pointed out to a lot of people online is that one of the things that really winds me up about the press is that there's times when your press, so you'll be working the opposition. They'll play the ball back to their back line or goalkeeper, and you'll jump with your front three, for example. The goal that Villa scored right at the beginning of that game, a great example of this. So press functionally works. You force the opposition back, but then you have Heung-min Son pressing one centre-back. You have Mikey Moore on the other side pressing the other centre-back. They have a full-back on the far side who isn't going to get marked, because Pedro Porro is the marking responsibility there, and he's still in his deep first-line phase. So he's got to jump 40, 50 yards up to get to that player. Yeah. They've also got the goalkeeper and another player running into their own half. So you're talking 2 Spurs players pressing 4 or 5 Villa players in their own half with space. In the Premier League, you are not going to get away with that, because those players are just going to play around you. And again, to come back to what Johnny was saying before, in the Scottish Premier League, that is going to probably result in the goalkeeper going long. But in this, at this level, that is not going to happen. They're going to play it around. They're going to find the spare player, and they're going to then start skewering your press. Yeah. The issue there is not the intensity of the press necessarily. It's the lack of efficiency of the press, which is, it's never going to be efficient. You're never going to win the ball in that scenario, or even necessarily cause a turnover, I don't think, apart from maybe every once in a while. And so what you've got then is you've got 2 or 3 players. So you've got Son jumping onto the centre back and then following through to the goalkeeper. That's a 40, 50 yard sprint. And this is something that doesn't get talked about when people are talking about the sprints, because they'll say, oh, well, other teams are also doing a lot of sprinting. And you're like, well, yeah, but what kind of intensity for the sprint? How long is the sprint? Is the sprint actually going to be rewarded by having some kind of turnover at some point, so we can talk about efficiency? And there's lots of scenarios. It happens in every Spurs game. I can show you clips from the Man United game the weekend where that was happening, where you've got 2 players pressing against 5 opposition players in space in their own half. They're just going to play through you. Yeah. And so, again, my issue there is, okay, have triggers. the players should be able to look at that scenario and say it's better for us not to press here than it is to go long, especially against a team like Manchester United, who actually, if you watch back the Liverpool game that Man United played in, Liverpool were just happy to let them have the ball deep because they weren't progressing it at all. You're almost more likely to allow them to produce ball progression by pressing them, forcing them to going long, and then winning second balls. So yeah, for me, a lot of this comes down to making your press more moderate, because the press at the beginning of the season was very good. It was producing decent underlying numbers, and you could make the argument that Spurs were one of the better pressing teams in the league. It hasn't seemed to have been sustainable, I suspect, because of the intensity of it. Yes. But also, I think that you moderate the press a little bit, and you don't get much of a drop off. You just become more discerning about when to go, the moments when those pressing triggers happen. Yeah. And you're still getting the level of intensity at the right moments that can force the turnovers, but you're also conserving energy because you're not going every time. And also, you're just making your players smarter. Your 100%. Players will then recognize when to go. Yeah. And there'll be a level of then interpretation coming into your press, whereby the players are actually deciding for themselves, rather than having this seemingly overarching mandate, which is we go all the time. Yeah, we go. Yeah, starting introducing a little bit more of that sort of moderation and thoughtfulness about the press, I think, would keep the press largely at the same kind of level of efficiency without the same kind of level of energy. I just quickly before I finish on this, but I looked. A few Spurs fans were saying to me online again, "What about Newcastle?" Because Newcastle are a great example of a team who press intensely, and I dug through the data, and what I found there is that actually what Newcastle are much better at than Spurs is that level of moderation and interpretation. They have much less time spent in intense high pressing, and in fact across every phase of play, high, middle, low pressure, they're putting in much less intensity, but they were producing, this season at least, the same sort of level of in fact a greater level of efficiency, so producing more efficient pressing but with less pressing actions. And that's just a great example, I think, of being able to work a scenario where you're actually still going to be efficient in certain high pressing phases like Newcastle are, but then Newcastle, what they do so well is they know when to drop back into a mid block and to just accept the opposition are going to have the ball for a time. You then have those triggers on backwards passes or miscontrolled touches. Those are the triggers for you to go high. You're going to be much more likely to get anything out of those sorts of pressing moments. And I think if you can start introducing that into the Spurs press, you'll probably see much better effects from it.
So I've got two questions. One, can we start the campaign to get you as Spurs' pressing coach? And the second would be, there's someone in our chat has asked, who you mentioned Newcastle, but who are the best who are doing it right now? Who could we take notes from on a better out of possession structure?
That's a loaded question, so I know where you want to go with this, I think.
Well, no, because actually my opinion on Iraola is it just more of the same, but maybe we can get to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few things here. I mean, I'm aware that this is a Spurs podcast, so I don't want to praise Arsenal too much. But I think Arsenal over the last few seasons have been one of the best pressing coach.
We'll move on from that. Thanks. Go on. No, seriously, do go on.
But I think the example of Arsenal is interesting because I think in previous seasons they've been much more intense in their pressing and they've had to dial it back in more recent seasons. Last season, I think, because actually teams were working out that the way that they press, you can actually increase the distances that they have to cover. Because a lot of Arsenal's pressing is based around these sort of hybrid systems where you'll have a player that's sort of covering two marking responsibilities, and their job is to jump from one to the other depending on how the phase of play is opening out. And teams realise, well, if Bukayo Saka is between one of the centre-backs and the full-back, if you can increase the distance between those two players, it makes it harder for him to actually be able to monitor both players at once. So last season, we saw that happening a little bit more in the second half of the season. So I think as a result of that, they had to actually dial back their pressing a little bit because of that. But yeah, so that's an example of a team who I think are still very, very good out of possession without necessarily having to rely on the intensity to make their pressing good. You mentioned Iraola. Iraola, yeah, I mean, a team where they definitely have the sort of intense pressing mandate. That's how they're going to find their upside. They're able to recruit players who have that out of possession upside, and then work situations where they're creating chaotic game states, but they're better prepared than the opponent in theory to be able to deal with those chaotic game states. So very much about, destabilizing the opposition's build up, winning the ball back, but then having the sort of ability to cause problems from those moments when they cause turnovers. And look, it's great, and I'm a massive fan of Iraola. I do question the ceiling of that kind of approach. In fact, before I get to that, it's worth saying I also think that they are much better at the triggers side of things. So you will very rarely see an Iraola team pressing up onto the goalkeeper when they have the ball all the time. There's certain phases where they will do that, and again, it's trigger based. So you make the decision on the basis of whether or not you think there's any value to pressing high onto the goalkeeper at that point. But a lot of the time, you'll see just the striker sort of sitting off the goalkeeper, covering one of the centre backs, the far side centre back, and then the players behind them ready to jump should the play develop. You won't often see them just going hell for leather from the off. It's a much more considered and pressing approach. But yeah, again, I think that the reason why Iraola approaches the game in that way is because he recognises that if he were to try and compete with the elite sides playing quote unquote elite football, whatever that means now, and the definition of elite football is becoming ever more I guess complicated by the day, but he realizes that if he were to compete on that level, he doesn't have the technical players to be able to do that, right? So he's finding his edge by doing this other approach. You could argue that Postecoglou is doing a similar thing, because I think at the beginning of the season, a lot of Spurs' best chances came from provoking high turnovers by pressing intensely. But I think, as we've seen in the long run, that hasn't really paid out for them. And I think the issue now is, the questions are being raised about whether or not they are creating enough from open play, which, I think when you are a team who have pretensions of getting into the Champions League spots on a regular basis, I think you probably have to make sure that your in possession approach is as sustainable as your out of possession approach as well.
I thought our in possession chance creation, to be honest, without the press, has been pretty poor overall. Compared, like, it seems like if we don't have a turnover, we don't create a chance. Correct. High turnover. So I've always been really worried about the in possession creation.
Yeah, I think especially this season, there has been a fallback into, well, we've got to be more intense in the press because that's where our chances are coming from. And the low block breaking down has not proven to be as dangerous as people hoped it would be with Postecoglou, despite the fact that in the SPFL he was getting pretty good results from that. But yeah, and again, this raises other questions. I mean, we've talked mainly about the out possession stuff, but the in possession stuff, I think, is there to be talked about. Whether or not these positional rotations that I think proved to be fairly functional last season, I just don't think that they are as functional as they have been. Teams are finding ways of dealing with those positional rotations, and I think there's an extent to which you could argue that there's a level of gimmickry to them, because essentially what's happening is, like, Jed Spence switches places with James Maddison. You end up with roughly the same structure, but just different players in those positions. And I think at first teams were like, oh, how do we deal with this? And now I think more and more teams are just sort of, they have their responses to that, and I just don't think that those rotations cause enough damage. And I've been on here every time, talked about two-way wingers who can go both ways against fullbacks, and part of the reason why I think Postecoglou's system requires that is because the system itself doesn't generate as much attacking upside as it may be purported to, and so you have to rely on getting those players into 1v1 matchups where you've got a talent advantage, and you can create that attacking upside through just having better players, right? So I do think there are questions to be asked about the in possession side of things as well. But again, all of this is complexified by the fact that injuries have meant it's probably unfair to judge the both in possession and out of possession. But yeah, again, that argument, I think, becomes weaker if you can make the further argument that it's because the intensity the game requires is reducing the level of players that you have at your disposal at any one time, right? So it is a very complicated argument, and I think I fall on a particular side of it. I think there's lots of smart people who fall on the other side of that argument as well. So I don't want to sit here sounding as though I'm sort of pontificating on it. But yeah, it's my sense of it, and particularly with the out of possession approach, like whatever little expertise I have is more in the out of possession phase. And for me, I read the press, I watch a lot of tapes, a lot of tape, and I look at that press and I think this is a naive press in the context of elite pressing at the highest level in the modern game. And that's all I can say really. Whether or not that's then causing these further injuries is up for debate, but even without that, I think there are better ways of pressing than Spurs currently are pressing.
John, it's been amazing. I'm going to ask you one more question. Just on our comments, we've had a few people pointing out how you have massively raised the IQ of the panel. Absolutely right. It's brilliant to talk to you. I want to ask you one final thing, John. I've been a bit of an Ange skeptic for quite a while. I would love nothing more than to be celebrating in Bilbao, having won the Europa League. But more than that, I'd love nothing more in 2 years' time for him to still be here and it to be working. I don't want another manager sacked. I'd love this to work, but I'm sceptical. Do you think it can? And if it can, he would have to have adapted. And do you think he will adapt? And do you think he can adapt?
Yeah, and I think that's where the argument stands and falls, right? And this was when I was talking about Postecoglou arriving in the Premier League. A lot of my concerns were about scalability. By which I mean, like, how do you take this system which works in these other leagues and then you scale it up for the Premier League? Now, a lot of people consider that to be a sort of fairly snobbish way of looking at things, but I think that's the reality. Like the Premier League is so tactically advanced now. All of the best managers in the world want to be there, and many of the best managers in the world are there. And as a result, it's just completely unforgiving from a tactical point of view. You get maybe 6 months grace with your tactical ideas, at which point all of the analysts have sort of taken them to pieces, and the coaches have found ways of causing problems to them.
We didn't get 6 months. I don't think we had 6 months, John. I think we were found out.
10 games.
I do. I think the 10 games after that. Gary Neal got sacked and went on M&F and was like, this is how you beat Ange Postecoglou.
Yeah. And look, I think that the way that you get around this, I think there's two things. In possession, you need to have a level of complexity to your play, by which I mean you can't just simply have a sort of one-to-one mapping of your ideas onto the pitch. Because if you do that, if a team can look at you and say, in this phase, your players are always going to do this, it's super easy to solve that. So you need to have a level of complexity in your possession play. Out of possession, though, you need, I think, a level of simplicity, which is you want to reduce the amount of complexity as much as possible whilst retaining the ability to stop the opponent. And I think on both of those counts, you could argue that Postecoglou hasn't matched up to expectations. In terms of whether or not he will do that, it's hard to know, because I think so much of his approach is based around this idea that there's a level of value in being able to motivate people through the sheer belief in your own ideas. And I think he's made a big part of, and I think that there's an extent to which that is true. The best coaches are the coaches who can get their players to run through fire for them, and it's clear that Postecoglou has retained the belief of his players. So that's a really important aspect of coaching. It's a very hard aspect of any human interactions to be able to generate yourself. So in that respect, I think he deserves praise. But at the same time, if that comes at the detriment of being able to adapt your ideas, then I think you're on a hiding to nothing. The best coaches in the Premier League are always the coaches who adapt. Pep Guardiola is the adaptive coach par excellence. People like to talk about him as a highfalutin idealist because his big picture view of how you play the game hasn't really changed since he started. But within his high idealism, there's a huge amount of space for flexibility, and he constantly adjusts the way that his team are playing. The same is true of, we talked about Arteta. If you chart Arteta's out of possession approach over the last 5 seasons, every season it's different. They change it every year. They recognise the weaknesses, and you see the tweaks and the fixes to that as time goes by.
But I think Jurgen Klopp as well. Obviously not in the Premier League now, but started and got picked apart for his gegenpressing and all of that. But he adapted and he got there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what, that's what the best coaches do. And so, yeah, I think I'm not convinced that Postecoglou will make those changes. I think that he could make those changes. I think he is a fantastic coach, a fantastic manager. And I would love to see him succeed as well.
Do you think that? Because a fantastic coach and a fantastic manager is somebody, as you say, should adapt, recognise the weaknesses, and therefore get the best in a given situation. If you think that he's not going to do that, is he a fantastic coach and manager?
I mean, I think that part of the problem here is that he's not really had to do that at this level before now. And so I think I give him a little bit of grace on that because, his approach has worked everywhere else he's gone. So I think it's a difficult process for him to go through as well. Not least because, I mean, we can talk about the injuries all we want, but there's plenty of other teams in the Premier League who are struggling with injuries because the level of intensity that's required, the level of physicality in the league has gone up in recent years. So there's an extent to which there's a lot of coaches who've maybe miscast the amount of physicality that they need to have in a sort of season by season basis for their team. So I'm not going to judge him on that. And then with that in mind, let's say that he has slightly misjudged the amount of intensity that is okay or isn't okay. It's then very hard to judge him off the back of that and saying, well, you should have adapted earlier. He hasn't had a huge amount of time to adapt to that. So I'm willing to give him a grace period on that because I think it is tricky to come into this league and know how to deal with it at the highest level. But yeah, I think that the jury is still very much out, and he is running out of time to be adaptive and make those changes. And you can have good coaches. I mean, maybe this would be how I would respond to your initial point there. You can have good coaches who aren't going to function at the highest level with elite teams. There's plenty of coaches out there who do a very good job of coaching mid-level teams as well. And I think sometimes we dismiss those coaches because we think in terms of the Pep Guardiolas and we think in terms of the Jurgen Klopps. But these guys are generational guys who, I mean, arguably Pep Guardiola is the greatest coach that we've ever seen in the history of football, which is, it seems harsh to then judge everyone off the back of that. And I think Postecoglou's system has enough to recommend it that, yeah, maybe it isn't going to work in this instance, in this league, for this team. But I still think that there's value to what he has done, he's achieved in his career. And I still think that he's, there's plenty of things about his approach that I think are laudable.
Jon, it's been amazing to talk to you. I hope that your fourth appearance, we come on whenever it is into next season and we're talking about how he's adapted. And Ange's still here. We've not even won the Europa League, but we've adapted and we've moved on. I'd love to know how he's adapted rather than maybe we've had this conversation a couple of times, but it's always fascinating. Genuinely, I would love to talk about how Ange has changed his ways. Jon, thank you so much for joining us. Sorry I kept you longer than I said we would, but it's...
No, thank you.
It's really great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
No, a great hat-trick, a classic hat-trick, a perfect hat-trick. Jon, thank you so much and we'll speak to you soon.
Cheers, Jon.
Cheers, Jon. Thank you so much.
Cheers, brilliant.
All the best. Cheers.